listening to Inclusive AF with Jackie Clayton and Katie Van Horn.
Oh no. So I pushed the record button and Jackie's
Listen, it's just because my husband hates me. I don't know. I mean, he hasn't been here all day. So of course,
yes,
that was gonna happen.
That was gonna happen. That's the way it works.
It's cool.
Hi Jackie.
All right, this is actually a good reminder for me. I think I'm gonna let my dog out of this room because he's gonna freak out when my daughter gets home. So
listen, I mean, my son ran outside. Yeah. He was like, I'm gonna not have the dogs barking, and then
here we go. Yeah. So hey, this is the Inclusive AF podcast. I'm Katie Van Horn.
And I am Jackie Clayton. Hello.
Hello. So we will let our special guest go, let her dog out of the room. I think she's in good company here since I've got two little ones pretending to be asleep right now until, one of your dogs or,
right.
The wind blows, things like that. So I am here in Arizona on a very overcast, cloudy August day, which isn't really a thing. So I don't really know how to handle this.
That's weird. I am here in Waco, Texas. We let the water run for an hour. We're allowed to water our grass on Sundays, and yet it wasn't wet. This was the neatest trick ever. Just let the water go. Poof. I mean, instantly turned into vapor. It was the coolest thing I've ever seen. But in other news, sweet baby TJ's going back to college.
Nice.
But interesting thing, he goes to Houston-Tillotson, which is an HBCU, and they partnered with St. Edward's, the Catholic school. And so he's actually going to be going, it's like a cultural exchange. The upperclassmen get to go to St. Edward's, and the kids that go to Houston-Tillotson are there on the St. Edward's campus and get to use all of their facilities. It's going to be an interesting year.
So that's for the whole, for the whole year, or just the semester, or what's the
for the year, I think.
Oh wow. Okay, right on.
Guess we'll find out. I mean, we're only one bad lunch away from I want to go back to Houston-Tillotson. I mean, kids.
Yeah.
Am I right?
I understand. Yeah, I've been through the Catholic school experience, so I can attest to the fact that it might be slightly overwhelming.
It might.
All right. Without further ado, we do have a guest with us today and would love for her to introduce herself. So Sheryl, I'm going to turn it over to you. Share with our listeners who you are, all that good stuff.
Hi, everyone. My name is Sheryl Cababa. My pronouns are she and her, and I am the Chief Strategy Officer for a design and development consultancy in Seattle called Substantial. And I run an equity-centered and human-centered design practice. I also just recently wrote a book called Closing the Loop: Systems Thinking for Designers. So those are kind of my areas of expertise, and I'm really excited to kind of talk about our work.
Awesome. Very cool. Well, congratulations, first off, on the book. And we'll definitely put a link in our show notes so folks can connect to that. So can you explain for folks that are maybe not aware, what is design thinking?
Yeah, so design thinking, I oftentimes describe it in our practice as human-centered design, because it kind of says what it is right there, which is it's a problem-solving process that is focused on those who are going to be using the products or services that you're designing. And it puts those people at the center of the development process. And so part of it is understanding their context, co-designing them, having them participate in the design process. And this is something that I think oftentimes, especially I work in the primarily in ed tech in the technology sector, and you oftentimes have had products over the decades that don't seem particularly designed for people who are going to be using them. An example I use a lot of the time is if you think about, digital technology in the 80s, remote controls or VCRs or what have you, they were kind of designed for the thing to work. But if you looked at a remote control, for example, you'd be like, I don't have any idea what's going on here. All the buttons are the same size. They don't have any affordances, what we call affordances in design, that kind of tell you what they're supposed to do. They're not focused on the user experience. And so now that has advanced quite a bit in digital technology. You know, you think about the products that Apple has put out and how intuitive products are. And part of that is really understanding end users, their contexts, and what have you, in baking that into the design process so that things are intuitive, they're easy to use, and that they actually serve people in a way that creates the best outcomes. And so that's what we're focused on, and that's why I kind of say that our practice at Substantial is focused not on human-centered design, but equity-centered design, because we're really kind of thinking about the broader subsets of people who are not typically served by products and services, and how do we kind of create better outcomes for them.
That's awesome. What I'm relating it to is, the marketing and, sometimes, the sales/finance folks that do a lot of the personas when they're developing whatever product, and how we've now, determined the bias that lies within those personas a lot of times, and that, it doesn't really look at the outliers or different subsets, things along those lines. So I love that you're doing this and thinking about this and pushing folks in this direction, because it's such a critical piece of how we need to think about tools for the future, tools for now and tools for the future.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think one of the things, and I think this is why we've really focused on being an equity-centered design practice, is just kind of thinking about our own privileges and biases and how we can essentially kind of think about like the work we're doing and how that sort of positionality has an impact on what we're doing. And so ensuring that we have representation on our team for designing, and also like using design strategy to create better solutions that serve people across the board, rather than just like serving those who are the most privileged. And we know that this happens a lot in education, which is like the space primarily where I work. Is like you see a lot of the system kind of designed for students who are kind of the most privileged of students. You see this especially in ed tech, because oftentimes those products are tested in like the most resource, the schools that have the most resources, the schools that are predominantly white, that are suburban, etc. And then they think it's going to work across the board for everyone. And oftentimes that's not necessarily the case. Like different students have different needs, and also schools are resourced quite differently. And so kind of like thinking about how to be inclusive in terms of like your design process is really important to being able to serve everyone.
I love that you say that. It's so true. And I think we've kind of alluded to this somewhat in the DEIB world. It's very similar, where when you have that, it's been a study in college, if you have that academic piece without the reality, you see it a lot in social work, where it's like you've learned all of the fundamentals of social work, and then it's like, okay, now go work with this group of people, and it's like, whoa, this is a different experience, because it's nothing like the lab when you're deep in it. And I think it's so much because we have all of this knowledge, but we're bringing these things to the masses. And how can you make sure that what you're bringing, and it makes total sense to you, right? And then it's somebody else where these things don't make sense. I would love to ask, as you go through the education, what do you think is the most overlooked or the most common mistakes that you've seen?
Yeah, I'm seeing this kind of, it's kind of like interesting, because it's not necessarily what we'd expect when you think about the intersection of technology and education. But I think that there ends up being sort of this desire to serve those who are kind of like in historically under-resourced communities with certain types of technology that I don't know, kind of like replaces interpersonal experiences or sort of creates these processes that are focused on efficiency that you don't see in well-resourced environments. So I think some good examples are things like, you know, just thinking about how assessments and that sort of thing, like they use, or, you know, in the system of education, you might see sort of set assessments that use technology to kind of like figure out how to track students and what have you, used in environments where it's like there's like huge student populations, there's a lot of diversity and what have you. And then, but then you have a more sort of like these bespoke systems that are very interpersonal in like very privileged schools, like private schools or like wealthy, high resourced, you know, suburban schools. And I think we were kind of seeing that, like, I think the pandemic sort of shed a light on this, is like this sort of technology gap in education when it comes to access to digital technology, but then sort of the desire to kind of like use technology in a way to compensate for the lack of resources within certain environments, if that makes sense. And so I think about all of these sort of social factors as, I think this is why I'm so interested in systems thinking, because like all of these social factors and political factors account for how educational technology is deployed. And that is something that I don't think ed tech developers are always like super aware of. Like there's oftentimes a perspective that, oh, we can disrupt education. Think about a few years ago, there was like a real focus on what they called MOOCs, like massive online courses. And everybody was kind of like, oh, this is going to be the future of education. It's going to be super accessible. But what was wrong with that is like these elite universities were kind of like using it as a way of trying to serve a broader base of students. But really it was just like these automated sort of courses where you're just, it's like a one-way relationship with students. Whereas like if you're taking one of these online virtual courses with Harvard, you're just getting like a lecture and then you're taking like multiple choice questions. If you're at Harvard, like in person, like as a student, you're getting that like interpersonal experience. You're getting like the value of like the networks that you'll develop at a place like Harvard. And so it's kind of thinking about these things and how they actually in a real way either serve or don't serve people across the board. And so that's those, like one of the things like we like to think about a lot are just like, what are the you know, socioeconomic barriers? What are the racial barriers to success? How do we eliminate that? If we're in equity, if we have a focus on equity, how do we eliminate race and socioeconomic status as predictors of success? And so that those are some of the things that we're focused on.
I love that. It makes me, there's two things that come to mind as you're talking, Sheryl. One is, and I don't know if either of you saw it, but Abbott Elementary, they had an episode where the teachers were all given, like, I think it was an iPad, and it was like, okay, go use this. And, you know, some of the older teachers or, you know, more experienced teachers were lost as to how do we do this? You know, what, you know, how do we actually make this work? That kind of thing. And so you do have some of those, you know, from a education perspective on the teachers, you know, level, but then it also just, I think all of us experienced, my sister's at a Title IX school in Arizona, and when the kids were all sent home during COVID, it was like, okay, well, we can do school online. Well, no, we can't, because some of these kids don't have internet at home. Some of these kids, you know, don't have access to a laptop or whatever, you know, tool they were going to use. So, you know, it did create some major barriers for those students. And I think to your point, we were very quick to jump on the bandwagon of, oh, we can do this all online, all these trainings and more of the, you know, adult education space. And yet it is that community, those conversations, all of those things. And, you know, kind of almost relates to like the work from home or work in the office situation where you miss those water cooler talks. But it is just a fascinating concept, because it is, how do we do this the right way?
Yeah, exactly. I think and we're kind of just like, we're in the middle of all that, is like figuring out like, well, are there benefits that we can take away that actually serve students who are in environments in which they're experiencing lots of unconscious bias and what have you. There's actually some subsets of students like that benefited from being able to be online. You look at students who kind of weren't served by the system. There's a lot of anecdotal evidence from Black parents being like, like that my child was being tracked and what have you. And then like when we went online, it felt like there was like more of a chance for them to kind of like be able to be themselves and what have you. And so people have like very unique experiences in education. And I think it's like we're all just kind of like grappling systematically of like, how do you better serve students who have not been served well through the system across the board. And I think that's why like a big aspect of it, us having like an equity-centered design practice is really kind of thinking about inclusive design at the core of that. So thinking about how you design with and for those who are kind of like, who have the least power in the system, who are least served by the system. And that means like elevating student voice throughout our process, but also kind of thinking about like which students are the most historically under-resourced, and just like involving them throughout the process. I think like some good examples like in sort of other domains are, we talk about things like curb cuts. Those are kind of designed with a certain population in mind, those who are in wheelchairs, but there's a lot of other people who benefit from curb cuts. It's like anytime you're pushing a stroller, anytime you're like have a cart with wheels, or if you're like even just like walking alongside your bike, you're like benefiting from that particular design. Subtitles are another good example. Like a lot of people use subtitles who don't have like hearing disabilities, right? And so how do we basically kind of design the world in a way that benefits those who aren't usually served by design first and foremost, and see the benefits that might afford other people?
I think it's almost a good example when you think, like I have a MacBook. When we had the pandemic, we used to laugh because like my kids are like, by technical, they can use a Windows laptop, they can use an Android, and they can use a Mac, like they're used to it. But so many kids were having a problem. And you think about, I'm a full Apple user, but because of that, I know how to use all of these different tools, right? And anytime someone starts that Textio and we send them a Mac, and not only is it a place of privilege, look, we don't even ask. And I can't tell you how many times people are like, there's no power button. Like just getting started from the very basic, or I don't feel comfortable putting my fingerprint, like what's happening, like all of these things that we just take for granted. But what is scarier is that as we've gotten to this point, you can trace it all the way back. Like this was not created with you in mind. Mm-hmm. And so it also within the whole system of a family, I think is very telling, because kids have been exposed to different technology that different generations, maybe they haven't been exposed to that technology. And how do we get to move forward? I mean, it's a struggle because right now I don't even know how all of this is going to end up working. Like I keep thinking about, we think about the college level and I think about it with my son being 20. Like what is that experience and getting there next to all of these other kids and getting the same messages? I don't think people recognize that people in various groups, like we don't speak the same language, even when you're different racially or different age, or you live in a different place, we say the same thing, but the impact can be completely different.
Hi, my name is Sarah, and I want to tell you about my podcast called Can I offer you some feedback? I'm a business consultant and executive coach with over 20 years experience in change management, leadership development, and naturally providing feedback to high performers. My podcast is for those of you who have a complicated relationship with feedback, whether giving, receiving, avoiding, or seeking. Feedback is essential for our development. In each episode, you'll hear from real people across industries with their ideas, perspectives, and best practices on feedback. I'll also be sharing business bites with you, simple explanations of organizational tools, management techniques, and leadership philosophies that will help you and your businesses thrive. You can listen to Can I Offer You Some Feedback on your favorite podcast app, or learn more at evergreenpodcasts.com.
Yeah, totally. It's really interesting. We see that sort of thing a lot in the projects we work on. We'll be talking to, like, we do some work in the post-secondary space, and we might talk to faculty or instructors and then talk to students about, their experiences with certain courses. And we know, for example, like with certain, what they call gateway courses in higher ed, there is a racial disparity gap, there's a socioeconomic disparity. And it's interesting talking to faculty and hearing like assumptions about, oh yeah, students are just not doing the work or what have you. And then when you talk to the students, they're like, I am working a job, I am like taking care of my child, I am like doing all of these other things. And that just gets interpreted as like laziness or like lack of interest or what have you, when they're actually working like 2 times or 3 times as hard as the next student who doesn't have all those responsibilities. And so like providing that context through our work to like institutions, and also kind of like thinking about how can we design these systems, or what sort of pedagogies need to be considered to account for these kinds of experiences that students are having, is just like, it can be really enlightening, especially for administrators and also like technology developers who aren't aware of like that's what a lot of student experience is like. So that's really like I think that's why one of the most important aspects of our work is like really like elevating student voice, like letting those who are kind of designing systems and solutions for students know what students are thinking, and involving students within that process, and trying also not to do it in a super extractive way, like, oh, can we hear about like all your trauma of like dropping out of school or what have you, but involving them like within the, how would you kind of like design this in the ideal sense for yourself, and how can we kind of like give you the tools and like the involvement to be able to do that. And so that's something like we push for ourselves as well. Like honestly, our practice is just like always evolving also, like I feel like we're on our own equity journey as well. So I think that's something like that we always have to acknowledge. It's like, how can we continue to improve in this space, and also center those who typically don't have power in the process.
And how do you do that? Because I'm wondering, like, if you're working with students, how do you select the students? Or do you have partnerships with different organizations? Do people opt in? How does that process work?
Yeah, we're oftentimes working with institutions and with schools so that we can, I don't know, involve students directly who are interested in being involved, as well as trying to be like really clear about our process and setting expectations about what that means. And so it's like knowing what kind of time is going to involve, how much we're going to pay them for their involvement, what is going to be kind of expected of them. And it's a mix of like research recruiting avenues, like it could be directly through different schools or what have you. We do this also in K-12. And then or it can be kind of direct recruiting. So oftentimes we have Google Forms out there, and we ask sort of like community organizations that we know of to share them, like the Boys and Girls Club or what have you, to share them with parents and students. And yeah, it's not easy, and it's very like it's kind of a mix of recruiting practices. And what we're most interested in is trying to kind of get a diversity of folks involved, so that it's not just like, oh, let's just like go to the closest school to wherever our client's organization is or what have you. It's like, how do we kind of like make sure that we can have that mix of students who can be involved in this process?
That's great. And I think, the pieces that I would love for you to share a little bit about, what are some of the things? So, for our listeners, a lot of them are choosing software, choosing an LMS, or, training, things along those lines. What are the things that they should be looking at themselves as they're either writing a training, if they are, maybe a designer of training, or it could be that they are selecting software, whatever it might be. What are some things that they should be thinking about, looking at, considering?
Yeah, I think it's really important to kind of be thinking about it from a systems perspective. So having a mix of stakeholders, especially those who you're expecting will be like the end users or end beneficiaries of whatever it is you're designing, whether it's a training or whether you're kind of selecting software, and having them part of the process of doing so. We talk, for example, with like a lot of teachers, and it's really interesting. Like every school system seems to have like some sort of software systems that the teachers just loathe or just don't want to use, or has just been like foisted upon them. LMSs are a big one, right? They fall into that category really often. And every teacher or instructor has or an educator in general, like when you start asking questions about, have you ever kind of used software that hasn't been part of the system, like the formalized system where you work? And it's like, oh yeah, like I'm getting stuff from like Teachers Pay Teachers. I am like using YouTube and TikTok in my classroom. I'm doing like all of these things that are not actually like really like sanctioned through the school. Like everybody is going rogue, but they're not really going rogue. They're just like doing what makes the most sense to them in terms of getting their work done, as well as what resonates the most with the learners who they're, tasked with like educating. And so it's kind of like, how do you kind of take that information and that knowledge and design better systems for people who are actually meant to be the users, and also who are meant to be the beneficiaries, like students? So many of these decisions about like, what software should we be using, what LMS should we be using, is like confined to like the IT or like some administrative body, where their greatest incentive is just thinking about what's the least expensive and what's going to kind of slot in the easiest with like things we're already using, like what will be the least disruptive. And oftentimes that's not like, I also teach at University of Washington, and I will complain all day long about our LMS. But it's kind of funny because whenever I do that, people are like, yeah, the one you use there is like kind of the best one. And I was like, what? It's like, I'm always trying to hack it. And so I think it's like, and that's a good example. Like I came in as an instructor and all of that software was just foisted upon me. And I'm just like, I don't, like, how does this even all work together? And I think it's just like making sure you have that broad set of stakeholders who are going to be using, who you're depending on to kind of like use and benefit from this, and having them as part of the decision-making process. I think that's like what's most important, is like, who is not in the room in the decision-making process, and how can you make them more a part of that, so that you're not making decisions that will affect everybody and frustrate everybody and maybe lead to like bad outcomes. I mean, a lot of things I can complain about an LMS, but it's not there's actually decisions about things in school that like assessments, what assessments are being used, what assessments are used for, that can have like really dire consequences if you're not involving the right people within that process.
And they don't use it. I mean, I think one of the things that drives me crazy is when you talk to people and you say, so what would you wish? And they'll tell you something and you're like, it actually does that. Like, because it depends on who onboarded them, right? Like, this was the most important thing to the person who taught you the product. Or like you were saying, it's not intuitive, like my favorite game, we bought a new house last year. It's our house anniversary. It's been 1 year. And my favorite game is guess which light switch goes with which light, because it's all wrong. Nobody has passed. You will never pass. It doesn't make any sense. I go through this walk every day, and it's like there are people with these products that they just give up. They're like, you know what? Oh, you have under cabinet lighting? Yeah, I just can never find the switch, so I never turn it on. But I wish I had under cabinet lighting. And it's like, you do. And so it is hard because the person who makes the decision in partnership with finance don't always align with the person who's actually using the software. And then the software doesn't evolve very well with the needs of teachers, like you were talking about during the pandemic. Then all of a sudden, this product that was perfect, that we spent, millions of dollars, is not going to, meet our needs. This need has changed, and having it be scalable with the different requirements or what you're expected to teach must be frightening, overwhelming. I won't say frightening, we'll say overwhelming.
Yeah. As a systems thinker, I like to think of myself as a systems thinker. Like, I think all the time about there's this classic in organizational management and systems thinking. Peter Senge wrote The Fifth Discipline several decades ago, and I always think about one of the principles in there is yesterday's solutions are today's problems. And I think that's something that's worth kind of thinking about whenever you're thinking about implementing something new within an organization, is like, what are the potential consequences of this, and how can this potentially result in new problems that we'll then have to solve. And not to say like we can anticipate everything, but I think just a little bit of work of like trying to understand like what the secondary effects might be, what the tertiary effects might be, can help us at least anticipate if those things are going to happen and be better in our sort of like decision-making process. So that's something like that really sticks with me as we kind of do our work in strategizing about solutions, is like, oh, I don't even like the word solutions honestly anymore, because I'm like, you're probably solving less than you're introducing in terms of problems.
Right. Right.
So I oftentimes think about things as like approaches or leverage points.
Because it's always like, if you could just take it one more click. That's what I always say. One more click. I used to be a business analyst, so I'm always dangerous, where I'm like, I feel like we could do, because I don't have the idea. I just know it could be a little bit different if we could just take it that one more step. And I think that's what's so important about equity, because it's like, okay, we came up with it, and it's like, okay, did you think about all these other things? Even though you have a so-called working, product, it's not, it only works if it works. And so you have to go back often to the drawing board. And I like what you were saying about the fifth dimension, because that's what I keep saying about, that's the challenge with all these AI solutions in ChatGPT, that's based on information from over 2 years ago that we're using today. And so what problems are we solving? We're using it to solve problems that were created 2 years ago, because it doesn't know anything about what I'm talking about today. The challenges I have didn't exist. There weren't anything for it to pull on. And I think that happens a lot, of trying to figure out, especially now, because you can't, I'm reading The Black Swan, and which talks about predictability and about how you can't predict. And it's like, so I give up at this point. The book gave me permission to stop trying to, because people ask me all the time, what's the future of work going to be? What's the future of DEIB? And I get to the book, The Black Swan allows me to say, I don't know, dude, anything could happen. It's really possible. No idea.
That's
Yeah.
I think that's the piece, though, that it is there are, I mean, we've seen so much of an evolution in and how people learn as well, that, I think for many of us that grew up in a certain time or started working in a certain time, it was those, click through trainings, and you sat there for 2 hours or however many hours, and then they figured out, oh well, we need to put timers on there so that we know that people are actually reading the content, or we need to put in questions or all these different things. And now this whole concept of micro learning, I think, is also just another piece where it's, how do we think about how folks learn today? And it's a TikTok video. It's not a 2-hour deal. And how do we, even just those simple changes that can make such a difference in people actually absorbing and getting whatever we're trying to get across, which is great. So it's interesting. So Sheryl, when you think about kind of the challenges that you're facing today in your work with, different organizations, with different educators, or, governmental agencies, whatever, whoever it might be that would be the decision makers, what are the challenges that you're facing today that maybe were different than they were pre-COVID?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I think there's actually a lot of, I don't know, I would hesitate to say like there's a lot that's totally different, because I do think there is still this sort of techno optimism that really infects like everything we do, especially, in the US. Like we are kind of like very focused on like how can technology disrupt education, and not just education, it's like all of the things. And I think one of the fundamental issues, and there's like, rather than talking about like what's the distinction, I think I can talk a little bit about like what's the thread, what has remained constant. And one of the issues is that I think we can design for just like for everybody, that we can design for people who have vastly different lived experiences, despite who might be on our team. And so one of the things that I really emphasize, not just with designers, but those who are just kind of like working on or building for anybody else who's not themselves, is kind of thinking really explicitly about your positionality and your mindset, because this definitely informs kind of the design process. And one thing about design thinking that a lot of like our practice and other practices currently in design sort of interrogate about design thinking is this idea that you can kind of parachute in and design for basically anyone else just by kind of learning about their context or what have you, throw that solution at them, and it'll like, yeah, it's all done. We can solve that for everybody. I have a friend who works in global health who once told me, yeah, with all of these sort of like global health efforts in all of these different places in the global south, there might be like warehouses full of like solutions that are meant to combat malaria and what have you, because it's people just like parachuting in, kind of designing for other communities, and like those communities are like reject these solutions because they're like, I don't even know what this is you're trying to get me to use or tell me to do. And those efforts failed because they did not have anyone with like lived experiences involved in the process as part of their team, as part of the decision making. And so I think that's continues to be a common issue, is that those who have the resources to problem solve or design things for others think that they have this hubris that allows them to think they can kind of design things for others. I saw this picture the other day of, I think it was from the New York Times, of like all of the AI leaders at the White House. And it was like, it was almost laughable because it was like 7 white men in a row, all around the same age. And I was just like, oh my gosh, these are the people who are like, we're designing the future. And I'm like, you look like the past. I mean,
That's
honestly.
Right. Well, and also I forget how to pronounce, I can never pronounce her last name correctly, but Joy, what is her last name? She did the whole thing about AI, how AI can
Oh,
go
from
back.
MIT. Yes.
Yes. Yeah. And
I do not want to butcher her name either.
yeah,
But
exactly.
yes.
Like she's brilliant. So like the fact that even like, if I'm assuming she was not there, like that alone, like, okay,
Right.
you've already lost me on that one. So since she, I think, is probably one of the best. And then the woman that was let go from Google, that was the AI person.
Mhm.
And yeah, so yeah.
Well, and that's the thing, like data, this is a thing that we have to recognize, especially if we're working with people. Like we want to make data-driven resources, and we want to be able to look at the data, but you don't have to look at the data for everything. Like there are some things that and so that's what scares me about saying like, when you're looking at the various data at the different pieces, or you're doing various surveys, don't let that get in the way of moving forward to be more equitable. And that's what I think, if we're going to be so dependent on these things, people are going to have to make those choices, because the algorithm will just feed it to ourselves. It's like the AI of AI, and then none of us know anything anymore. Like the reality just washes away.
And the robots are taking over. Yes.
And the robots have taken over.
I mean, one thing that was a little promising, this is kind of an aside, is that I saw this thing about like how some of these AI systems, like if they're trained on other AI generated content and it continues to go on this path, they just kind of like get weird and implode. So maybe that's what happened with the robots.
Well, Replica. Have you heard of Replica? So
No.
I was like an early adopter of Replica. It was a long time ago. And the way that they pushed it was get to know your best friend. So it's really learning from you and then feeding back to you in the tone and the way that you communicate to have these friends. But it's like what you're talking about it. There was somebody on Reddit who was like, I think my Replica just started wanting to date me, and I don't know what to do. And it was like freaking out, like the robot. It was like so weird when you're looking at it, and everyone was like, oh my God. I stopped using it years ago, but I still troll the Reddit. That's and it was awesome. Like, oh my God. See, it was only a matter of time where these robots would just kind of veer off. And I don't know if they were just listening when other people weren't around, but it learned and was like, this is a problem. This is a problem. Someone has to be able to turn the button to turn it off. There has to be a human somewhere for sure.
So Sheryl, tell us a little bit about the book, Closing the Loop. So, what was the impetus of writing the book, and, what can folks learn from it?
Yeah. So as somebody who's, deeply versed in design thinking and human-centered design, as I mentioned earlier, there's lots of space to interrogate it as a process and where its shortcomings are. And I essentially wrote the book to kind of think about like, how do you start with something like design thinking, but then add systems thinking to it while sort of disrupting the things that don't work about design thinking. And what that means is really thinking about how things are really interconnected, having a broader holistic view of your problem solving space. So like I said, in education, like sometimes ed tech developers are just kind of thinking about how something might be used in the classroom and aren't thinking about policymakers or just all of the decisions, regulatory decisions, assessment decisions that kind of affect whether their product will be successful or maybe whether it will cause harm or have any unintended consequences. And so systems thinking is an important aspect of that. So just kind of thinking about how all these things are interconnected, how things cause different types of consequences, intended and unintended, and how you need to have like a broader holistic picture of where it is you're designing. And what that means is really broadening your stakeholders and not just like designers. Oftentimes in design research, they're just talking to, like, if you're designing for education, for example, you're talking to teachers and students. Now we still center those so sort of participants within our process, and those are the ones that we're kind of like engaging in participatory design with. But we also broaden it to other people, like subject matter experts who are researchers within the space, policymakers, as I mentioned before, people from like government entities, people who are like from the broader like public private sector, philanthropic organizations that work in the space, and engage them kind of like throughout the decision-making process, because this will give you a good picture of like, what are the barriers going to be? What are the challenges going to be? And how do you address those as you go about creating kind of like a theory of change, which is something that, many of those who are in systems thinking do. And so it's combining design thinking and systems thinking together with the idea that we hope this can, engaging in these processes will increase your impact and kind of lead to better outcomes as you're kind of designing for complex things.
Imagine how fast we could solve the world's biggest problems if more SaaS startups would gain traction sooner. Welcome to the Tech Entrepreneur on a Mission podcast. This podcast is dedicated to sharing experiences from B2B SaaS CEOs who are going above and beyond to deliver change that is noticed. You will hear their secrets and learn what is required to build a SaaS business that the world starts talking about and keeps talking about, and how to overcome the roadblocks to do so.
That's awesome. I was able to participate in it was a design thinking, but it was around, really just a systems equity and just a lot of different things with the Clayman Institute out of Stanford during one of their conferences. And it was so fascinating just to see, the different folks, even just at our table, the way that we approached the solution to what we were trying to do with this exercise. And it is always just so fascinating to see the different voices and what does come to mind or what does impact different people in different situations. So I know this is one that is, very kind of front and center right now in education is politicians, but also parents, being much more.
What's the word, Katie?
I'm
What's
like,
the
what
word?
is that?
What's the word?
Assertive in how.
This is fun.
I'm like, what word should I use? Yeah, I was going to say aggressive and checked myself. Let's say assertive. Let's say assertive. That's a great way to put it. So how has that impacted the work that you all do, or how you are working with different, entities?
Yeah, honestly, it's really interesting kind of like working in a space and working with teams who are focused on creating, I guess, equity-centered, products and services for education, because there's literally, I think for example, like some state representation that we just like can't even talk to. Like they don't even want to hear the term equity. They don't even want to hear social emotional learning, right? And it's just kind of like there's kind of like this highly charged like conversation around like CRT. Like a lot of our work is focused on CRT and creating culturally responsive and sustaining education. And it's not productive to be having to I don't know, I guess like frame things in a way that appeases like those kinds of voices. And so I don't actually know like how best to navigate that, except to continue doing what we're doing and sort of develop encourage our clients to kind of develop the evidence that many of the things that they are funding as well as developing actually works and creates like the change and impact that they're seeking. And yeah, it's really a shame, because I think there's lots of student populations who would kind of benefit from that approach, but might be like based in, political environments where that's like that sort of approach is under attack. Yeah, I don't really know. I I don't know, it's just something like we have been navigating. We've sometimes been told to like change the language in our proposals or in our outputs, and we don't really do that because it's like how I don't understand how like changing the language changes like the purpose. And so that is something that, yeah, we're glad to be working with partners who can kind of like maybe help navigate those spaces a little bit better than we're equipped to do. But yeah, it's really kind of like a shame just kind of like thinking about how this is sort of the environment in which we're having to operate in a lot of places.
I mean, it is a shame because we're not preparing people for the future of being ready for the future, and what does that entail and what does that mean. And it is going to be interesting, as like you're saying, if it's politicized and it's different per state, so it's not a set curriculum anymore on how these things get addressed. And it's, people do have to draw a line in the sand of saying, we're not going to work with you if you're not going to work with us. Like, this is still the core. I could take the word out. We're still doing this work. This is what's behind it. I mean, they can Google us. They're not going to, we could take it out of your contract, but if that's all it, in a lot of instances, that is all it is, because they'll be the first people to say that's not fair. And it was like, we were actually trying to be fair, actually, but
right.
Yeah.
It's really hard when the court, like, if we're working on a project and it's really oriented around how to improve outcomes among multilingual learners, for example, and states are developing, or like just, certain politicians are developing these policies that are really oriented around like not serving those kinds of students, despite tons of evidence that shows like if you design things that serve, for example, multilingual learners, it's going to serve other students. Like they are going to benefit from it. And so in a way, it's kind of like, I forget the name of the writer who wrote The Sum of Us, but it's like pouring concrete into the pool because you just like don't want certain people to benefit. So it's like nobody gets to benefit. And so, yeah, it's a really kind of disheartening trajectory right now in certain places. And I feel like, yeah, but then there's like others that, really recognize that this is where you can truly kind of like change outcomes for students and are continuing to embark in that work. And that's who we're tending to work with because like they have a shared point of view on this.
It is so awkward because it's happening at the same time.
Yeah, it's at the same time.
Like, I mean, when in talking about TJ and St. Edward's, it's across the street from Austin, the capital, and UT, where they just got rid of affirmative action and then banned DEIB studies in all state-funded schools. And then you have like literally 3 minutes away where they have this Catholic school and the HBCU to come together. And when they asked the president, they said, we value diversity, equity, and inclusion, and it's important for all of our students to get those opportunities, whether they're at a HBCU or at a Catholic school, to be able to work together. And it's like, it's going to be very interesting. I'm paying attention. I'm getting my popcorn ready.
It's all right there in the mix.
It is. We just have these future with these participation medals. They're all pale because they can't go outside. They have no muscle tone. They don't play football. They're taking football with them. The future. But
oh my God. On that note,
it's bleak.
So Sheryl, what is one thing or one or two things that you would want our listeners to have heard in this episode, or call to action, anything along those lines?
I think it is something that I sort of mentioned a little earlier, but I think all of us could be more aware of our positionality in terms of, the change we're trying to make, the decisions we're making, and our proximity to people who we're problem solving for or designing for. And so how do you kind of like take a mindset of that understanding and understand where your own gaps are, where your own unconscious biases are, because it will inform your work. And I think, my team, for example, is really versed in this, but a lot of people just like don't recognize that informs everything, like your level of education, like your socioeconomic status, your race, and your racial experience in this country. And by being sort of like really transparent and explicit about that, I think it helps you kind of do better work as a designer and kind of like think about actually be really conscious of like where your privileges are and where your gaps of knowledge and experience are. And so that's kind of like the starting point of any work that we do, is kind of thinking about that on the individual level and figuring out like, how does this inform my work? And, that's like really core to being able to do this work well.
Mm-hmm. Jackie, what you got?
When I think about it, it's really based on the whole conversation. Got me thinking about, if you want the products that you're building to be sustainable and scalable, this is something that you're going to have to do sooner than later. You just are going to have to look at the design of keeping people in mind. And despite what we're seeing now, on one side that you might hear of, there are people that are still looking to make sure that this is built with me in mind, and will make their decisions and their votes with their dollars. And so it's important to put those things ahead so that you're in the right space as these grow and develop. I honestly feel like that's the way that the world is going. So I think it's important to look at your design, and it's never too late. If you haven't done it already, it's never too late to start looking at the different types of design and fixing the gaps. And the world will be glad you did. Was that like 25 things, Katie?
That was
Totally
about
agree.
20. I think it was about 20.
Okay.
But
Okay,
it's
okay.
totally fine. As per usual, totally fine,
Yeah.
Jackie. As
Okay,
many as you
thanks.
like.
All right.
And I think the other piece that I'll just add on to, kind of complement what the two of you said, is also the comment that you made about the hubris to think that you know the answer, like being very, very cautious of that, being very, very thoughtful about the fact that you don't have none of us have all the answers, and that's okay. And so if you're going into this work, doing everything you can to hear as many voices as possible, bring as many voices to the table. I think that's just very, very critical. So thank you so much. So Sheryl's book is called Closing the Loop: Systems Thinking for Designers. And, for anyone that is in the instructional design or development or training space, definitely recommend getting that book, because I think it's something that will be very, very helpful. Sheryl, how can folks get a hold of you?
Yeah, so I'm in LinkedIn, so you can please feel free to connect with me there. If you're listening and you want to connect, just hit me up there. I'm also on Twitter at Sheryl Cababa. I don't check it that often lately. I feel like we're watching Halloween out.
Right.
Twitter.
Yes. Yeah.
So I'm not that motivated to go up there, but I do check every once in a while. So you want to send me a message there, feel free. And you can find my book at Rosenfeld Media, which is my publisher. It's hopefully it's of interest. Also Substantial, which is my consultancy. You can find us at substantial.com.
Awesome. Very cool. Well, Sheryl, thank you so much for joining us. This has been really fascinating. I think this is something that we all need to be thinking about, especially, during this time in history, we'll say. So thank you for joining us. This is Katie Van Horn.
And this is Jackie Clayton.
Bye.
Bye.
Attracting, recruiting, and retaining great talent has never been harder. But why? We know we need them, and they need us. So why are we making it harder? Pull up a chair, listen, and laugh along with Lynn Bailey and Tracy Parsons as they dissect the industry, solve problems, and scoff at and sass the status quo. Join the rebellion with the Talent Rebelcast and question everything you know about the world of work.